When you wear a grey uniform and push a mop through hallways that smell like expensive coffee and dry erase markers, you learn to move the way water moves, around things, between things, never stopping long enough for anyone to look. You become part of the building, like the fire exits and the ventilation hum. Necessary, invisible, forgotten the moment someone turns away. His name was Marcos Eligio Reyes. He was 38 years old. He had a cracked left molar he couldn't afford to fix, a studio apartment in East San Jose he shared with his cousin's family, and a janitor's badge that said Night Crew Allied Building SERVICS in letters small enough to match the way the world saw him. He pushed his cart down the third floor of Helion Technologies at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in March, and the building was empty except for the hum of servers in the locked room at the end of the hall and the distant sound of rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Outside, the lights of Silicon Valley glittered like something pulled from a dream, the kind of dream that belonged to other people. Marcos had stopped dreaming a long time ago. Or so he told himself. He was born in a small city called Salamanca, in the state of Guanajuato, Mexico, a place famous for its shoe factories and its heat and its habit of sending its sons north. His father had made that trip in 1987, before Marcos was born, and had spent 20 years working construction in California, sending money home every 2 weeks without fail, like a man paying a debt he believed he owed to the people he loved most. Marcos grew up watching his mother count those dollars at the kitchen table. He grew up understanding that love in his family looked like sacrifice. It looked like absence. It looked like a man you only knew through phone calls that crackled with distance and a voice that was always tired. He crossed the border himself at 19, in the back of a truck that smelled like axle grease and fear, because his father had a stroke and couldn't work anymore and someone had to. There was no other calculation, no other option he could see. He arrived in San Jose with $300, a phone number for a man named Gerardo who could get him work, and the kind of determination that people who have no safety net develop early and carry always, not because they are brave, but because they cannot afford not to be. He got work construction first, then landscaping. Then at 31, through a cousin who knew a supervisor, he got the janitor job at Helion Technologies, working the night shift, 5 nights a week, 9 p.m. to 5 a.m., with benefits that were thin and pay that was thinner and a commute on 2 buses that took 40 minutes each way. He had been doing it for 7 years. He was good at it, not because the work itself required greatness, but because Marcos Reyes approached everything that way. He cleaned bathrooms so thoroughly that the morning crew never had complaints. He emptied recycling bins without being asked twice. He learned the names of the security guards and remembered their kids' birthdays, and never, not once in 7 years, called in sick when he wasn't. And he noticed things. That was the part nobody expected from the man with the mop. He noticed the whiteboards with their diagrams and equations that people never bothered to erase before they went home. He noticed the words people used in the conversations they had forgetting he was in the room: asterisk latency, API deployment, sprint, stack, the language of a world he was standing at the edge of but not inside. He noticed the laptops left open on desks, screensavers cycling through photos of beaches and kids and dogs. He noticed, most of all, the library. Helion Technologies had a small room on the second floor that the employees called the library, though it was really just a room with shelves of technical books and a few beanbag chairs and a whiteboard. Nobody used it much after 7 p.m. The books sat there with their spines uncracked: programming languages, software architecture, machine learning, product design. Books that cost $80 each, sitting on shelves like decoration. Marcos noticed them the way a man who is very hungry notices food that hasn't been eaten. It started with one book. He wasn't proud of it the first time. He slid it off the shelf like he was doing something wrong, like an alarm might go off. Python Crash Course Asterisk, 2nd edition. He didn't even know what Python was. He'd heard the word once on a whiteboard where someone had written asterisk backend, Python/Django in blue marker. He had looked at it for a long time while he wiped down the conference table, the way you look at something in a language you're learning. He took the book to the supply closet on the 2nd floor and read it for 20 minutes during his break. He understood almost none of it. He put it back exactly where he found it and went back to work. The next night he came back to it. And the night after that. Within 3 weeks he was bringing a small notebook and writing things down, not code, not yet just words. Definitions. He wrote asterisk variable and next to it he wrote asterisk like a box that holds a value asterisk. He wrote asterisk function and next to it asterisk a machine that does one job. He wrote in Spanish sometimes when the English wasn't landing right, and sometimes in both, in the margins of his own understanding. He was slow, painfully slow. There were nights he read the same page 4 times and still couldn't make it land. There were nights he closed the notebook and sat in the supply closet and thought about how stupid this was, how absurd it was, a 38-year-old janitor who never finished high school thinking he could learn to write software. He thought about the people who worked in this building. Young people, most of them. People who had degrees from Stanford and Carnegie Mellon and MIT. People who had started coding when they were 12, in their parents' basements, with computers their parents bought them. He thought about all that, and then he opened the notebook again. Because what was the alternative? The alternative was what he had. And what he had was this, a studio apartment where he slept on a fold-out couch because his cousin Adriana and her 2 kids got the bedroom, $62 in his checking account on the Friday before payday, a cracked molar that sent a spike of pain through his jaw every time he bit down on the left side, a phone with a cracked screen, a bus pass, a uniform. He loved his cousin's kids. He loved Adriana, who worked 2 jobs herself and always left a covered plate of food for him in the fridge when he came home at 6 a.m. He was grateful for what he had, genuinely, not the performative gratitude of someone who has forgotten what it is to want more, but the real kind, rooted in having known what less looked like. But gratitude and ambition are not enemies. That was something Marcos had figured out on his own, without anyone telling him. You can be thankful for the plate of food in the fridge and still hunger for something that can't be covered in foil. He started using the office computers. This happened by accident the first time. He was cleaning the second-floor open workspace at around 2 a.m., the room with the long communal tables and 40 workstations, and the big monitors and the plants that someone watered on Tuesdays, and he finished early and the room was empty, and one of the computers was logged out but still on, its screen glowing, a terminal window open from whoever had been using it last. He stood in front of it for a long time. He typed something. Print hello. He had read about this. This was the first thing, the beginner thing, the thing everyone wrote when they were learning Python. He had read about it in the book in the library and laughed to himself because it seemed too simple. But now he typed it into the terminal, 1 letter at a time, looking between his fingers and the screen, and he pressed enter. Hello. The computer said it back to him. He stood there in the glow of the monitor in the empty office at 2 a.m. and felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. He felt like he had made something. He was careful, he was always careful. He used computers only when rooms were empty and would stay that way. He never touched anyone's personal machine. He logged out of every session, cleared every browser history, left no trace. He learned quickly survival will do that, will sharpen a mind the way a whetstone sharpens a blade, that he could use the logged-out guest terminals in the common areas to access free online courses. He found Free Code Camp. He found Khan Academy. He found a free Python course on YouTube that a man named Corey Schaefer had made. And he watched those videos on muted screens with the captions on, because he couldn't risk the sound in the silent building. He took handwritten notes on everything. After 6 months, he could write a basic program. After 9 months, he could build a simple web scraper. After a year, he had filled 3 notebooks. He told no one. Not Adriana, not his cousin Gerardo, not the security guard named James who was the closest thing Marcos had to a friend in that building, who brought tamales from a place on Story Road and left one for Marcos every Friday in the break room. Not his mother in Salamanca, who he called every Sunday, who asked when he was coming home, who he told always, patiently, *soon, mama, soon. He told no one because he had learned, early in his life, that if you say a dream out loud before it's ready, people don't protect it. They poke at it. They find the holes, and they point them out, not to be cruel but because they care about you and they don't want you to be hurt, and so they do the work of hurting you themselves early, before the world gets the chance. He wasn't ready for that. He kept building. The idea came from a problem he was living inside. It was January, 14 months into his self-education, and Adriana's daughter, 8 years old, named Sophia, round-faced and serious and obsessed with dinosaurs, came home from school crying. Not the crying of a child who scraped her knee. The crying of a child who has been told in so many words that she doesn't belong. The school had assigned tablets for homework. Every student was supposed to complete their assignments online. The Wi-Fi at their apartment was spotty at best, non-existent at worst. The building was old, the router was shared between 12 units, and by 7 p.m. every night the connection dropped to almost nothing. Sophia's teacher had sent home a note expressing concern about Sophia's missing assignments, and Sophia, who was 8 years old and took school very seriously, sat at the kitchen table and cried because she was being marked down for something she had no control over. Marcos sat next to her and helped her with the assignment offline, writing her answers in her notebook to type up later. but he couldn't stop thinking about it. The connectivity problem, the gap between what the school assumed every child had access to and what children like Sophia actually had. It wasn't just Sophia, it was the whole building. It was the whole neighborhood. He thought about it on the bus ride to work. He thought about it while he mopped the floors of a company that was building, at that very moment, products designed for people who had never had to wonder whether their internet would work. He went to the library on his break that night and found 2 books he hadn't touched yet, one on networking fundamentals and one on mobile application development. He started with the networking book. 3 months later, he had a rough concept in his notebook, not a business plan, not a pitch deck. A description in his own words, half Spanish, half English, of an application that could allow apartment buildings and neighborhoods to share and optimize their internet bandwidth collectively. A kind of cooperative network management tool that would route bandwidth intelligently based on usage patterns, so that the heaviest users weren't drowning out everyone else, and the people who needed it most at a given moment, a kid doing homework, a parent on a video interview, would get priority. He called it *Red Common Network. He drew the interface by hand in his notebook, the way he imagined it looking on a phone screen. He wrote down every question he didn't know how to answer. There were many. He answered them one by one, over weeks and months, in the library at 2 a.m. His hands were the problem. He had beautiful hands for his work, strong, careful, used to pressure and repetition. But by 2-3 in the morning, after 6 hours of physical labor, they shook slightly when he tried to type, not from illness, from exhaustion. There were nights he sat at the computer and his fingers missed the keys and he had to stop and put his hands flat on the desk and breathe, and remind himself where he was and what he was doing and why. He gave up sleep. Not entirely, he got 4 hours most nights, sometimes 5, but the stretch between his break and the end of his shift, those last 2 hours, became his. He stopped eating in the break room. He worked through his second break. He brought food from home in a container and ate at the desk with one hand and typed with the other. He lost weight, not healthily. His face hollowed a little. Adriana told him he looked tired and he said he was fine, and she looked at him the way women who have survived difficult things look at people they love who are clearly not fine, which is to say she looked at him with a worry she didn't push, because she also understood that a man needs the dignity of his own struggle. He kept building. At the 18-month mark, he had a prototype. It was rough and buggy and broke every third time he ran it, but it was real. It was a thing that existed in the world that had not existed before he made it. He ran it in the terminal late one night, and it connected 2 simulated devices and routed a test packet between them according to the prioritization logic he had built, and the output came back clean, and he sat back in the chair and pressed his palms against his eyes and felt something so large it almost frightened him. He thought about his father, lying in the hospital in Salamanca 20 years ago with a stroke that had taken half his face and most of his words. He thought about his father's hands, which had built walls for 20 years. He thought about what his father would say right now in this empty office if he could see his son sitting in front of a computer at 2:30 in the morning in Silicon Valley with a prototype that worked. He thought his father would not have the words, just like him. At some point, something shifted. It wasn't a single moment. It never is. It was the accumulation of 2 years of late nights and filled notebooks and small wins and spectacular failures. The times the code broke in ways he couldn't diagnose for days. The times he had to unlearn something he had learned wrong and start over. The time he accidentally overwrote 3 weeks of work because he didn't understand version control and had to rebuild it from memory. But somewhere in there, Marcos Reyes stopped thinking of himself as a janitor who was secretly learning to code and started thinking of himself as someone who was building something. The distinction mattered more than he could explain. It was the difference between doing something in shame and doing something in private. He wasn't hiding because he was ashamed. He was protecting something fragile that wasn't ready to be touched yet. There is a difference. He understood it in his body before he understood it in words. He started reading about the startup world, about how apps were funded and launched and brought to market. He read about Y Combinator and venture capital and pitched decks and seed rounds, and the more he read, the more he understood that the world he was reading about had almost no room for someone like him. Not because of what he knew or didn't know, but because of who was in the room when decisions were made. He wasn't naive about this. He was 39 years old and had lived his entire American life as a person who navigated systems that were not built for him. He was not shocked to discover that the startup world was another such system. He filed it under things that are true that I cannot change and therefore will work around, and kept moving. He found through a forum online a community of self-taught developers. He made an account. He posted questions under a username that gave nothing away. He got answers. He gave answers eventually when he knew enough to give them. He made connections that were entirely digital, entirely anonymous, and yet felt more real than most human contact he'd had in years because they were about something. They were about the work. One person in that community, a woman named Priya who lived in Austin and built accessibility tools, told him his concept for Red Common was solving a real problem and he should apply for a startup accelerator. She sent him 3 links. He looked at the application requirements. Bachelor's degree or equivalent experience. Must be authorized to work in the United States. He closed the browser. He sat with that for a long time. This is the part of the story that most people don't tell, not because they don't know it happened, but because it's the part that doesn't fit neatly into the narrative of triumph. It's the part where a man sits with the full weight of what he is up against, and has to make a choice that isn't between success and failure, it's between continuing and stopping. Marcos sat with it for 3 weeks. He went to work, he cleaned the floors. He mopped the hallways of Hellion Technologies, where people were building companies that would go public and change industries and make millionaires of people who had already been comfortable. He emptied their recycling bins. He wiped down the whiteboards where they diagrammed their futures. He rode the bus home in the early morning, while the city woke up around him. He thought about Sophia, who was 9 now, who had gotten a perfect score on her science test, and told him about it at the kitchen table with her whole face lit up, who wanted to be a paleontologist and had no reason yet to believe she couldn't. He thought about his mother. He thought about his father's hands. He thought about the prototype on the USB drive he kept in the inner pocket of his jacket, against his chest, every single night. At the end of the 3 weeks, he went back to the computer. He could not apply to an accelerator. He could not pitch a room full of investors. He could not do many of the things that the path he had read about required, but he could build. He could keep building and make the thing so good, so undeniably useful, that the conversation about who he was would have to come after the conversation about what he made. He had one card he hadn't played yet. He knew a lawyer. Not personally, but Adriana's neighbor, a Filipino-American woman named Carmen who had lived in the building for 15 years, had a son named Daniel who was an immigration attorney in San Francisco. Carmen had told Adriana about him the way mothers talk about their children, with a particular kind of pride that is also a kind of prayer. Adriana had told Marcos years ago, in passing. Marcos knocked on Carmen's door on a Sunday morning. He brought tamales because James had taught him that food was a kind of language. He sat with Carmen at her kitchen table and explained, carefully and honestly, what he was building and what he needed to understand about his situation and whether there were options he hadn't found yet. Carmen called Daniel that afternoon. Daniel called Marcos that evening. The conversation lasted 2 hours. Marcos had been in the country for 20 years, undocumented, paying taxes through an ITIN number he'd had since his 2nd year, a fact that Daniel found significant. There was a process, there was a path. It was not fast and it was not simple and it would cost money he didn't have yet, but Daniel laid it out for him in plain language and at the end said, "What you're describing, this application, I want to understand it better. Can you show me what you've built?" Marcos opened his laptop. He showed Daniel the prototype. He showed him the notebooks. He explained Red Common in English, and then when the English ran out of precision, in Spanish, and Daniel, who was bilingual and whose own parents had come from Manila with nothing, listened with the particular attention of a person who is hearing something important. "You built this," Daniel said, not a question. "Yes." "On the computers in the building where you work?" "Yes." Daniel was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Marcos, I want to help you." Daniel had a colleague. Her name was Sophia Park, no relation to the 8-year-old dinosaur enthusiast, and she was a tech attorney who had helped 3 startups navigate early-stage legal and structural issues. She agreed to a meeting. Marcos wore the only collared shirt he owned that wasn't his work uniform. He took the BART to San Francisco for the first time in 4 years. He sat in a conference room that looked, he thought, not entirely unlike the conference rooms he cleaned every night, except that now he was on the right side of the table. He showed them everything. The prototype, which had grown significantly. The concept, which he had now documented in a 30-page document he'd written and rewritten 6 times in English, translated from the Spanish he'd first written it in. The research, 8 months of market data he'd gathered, hand-tallied, about internet connectivity gaps in low-income housing across 4 major cities. The hand-drawn interfaces that had become, over time, actual wireframes he'd learned to build in a free design tool. He was in that room for 3 hours. When he left, Sophia Park walked him to the elevator and and said something he would remember for the rest of his life. "I've sat across from a lot of founders," she said. "Most of them have money and degrees and mentors and a network. You have none of that." She paused. "What you have is harder to find." He didn't ask her what she meant. He was afraid that if he opened his mouth, something embarrassing would happen. He rode the BART back to San Jose and walked home from the station in the November cold and sat on the steps of his building and looked at the sky for a long time. The next 14 months were the hardest of his life. And his life had already been hard. Daniel worked on his immigration case pro bono because he was that kind of person and also because he believed in what Marcos was building. The process was slow and grinding and required paperwork in triplicate and waiting rooms and government offices that smelled like institutional defeat. There were setbacks, a form returned for errors, a date missed, a document that had to be obtained from a Mexican government office that took 11 weeks to respond. Marcos kept working his night shift. He needed the income. He needed the insurance. He needed, honestly, the structure. The requirement to show up to something every night gave his days a shape he could build around. He worked on Red Common every spare moment. Sophia connected him with a small non-profit that supported immigrant entrepreneurs. Through them, he found a community workspace in East San Jose, a desk he could use for 6 hours a week, with Wi-Fi and a phone charger and other people around him who were building things from the edges of systems not designed for them. He was the oldest person in the room by 10 years, most days. Nobody treated this as significant. They were too busy. He entered a local pitch competition. Not the famous ones, not the ones with venture capitalists in the audience, but a small community one organized by a credit union and a business development center, aimed at underserved entrepreneurs. The prize was $5,000 and 6 months of mentorship. He practiced his pitch for 3 weeks out loud, alone in the apartment at 6 in the morning when Adriana and the kids were asleep. He practiced it in English and translated phrases he wasn't sure about. He recorded himself on his phone and watched it back and cringed and did it again. He asked Priya, the developer from Austin, to watch a video of him running through it and give him feedback. She did, and her feedback was specific and sharp and useful, and he adjusted. On the day of the competition, he arrived early and sat in the parking lot in Adriana's car. She had lent it to him, her most significant gesture of faith, and breathed for 15 minutes. Then he went inside. There were 12 entrants. He was the only one over 40. He was the only one who had arrived alone. Most of the others had co-founders, advisors, teammates who leaned in and whispered encouragement before they went up. He had his notebook. He went up 7th. He stood at the podium with his 30-page document in a manila folder he didn't open. He looked at the panel of 5 judges, a banker, a city councilwoman, 2 entrepreneurs, and a professor from San Jose State, and he said, "My niece couldn't do her homework. I couldn't pay the internet bill. I spent 2 years learning to build a solution. I want to tell you about it." He talked for 12 minutes. He did not win first place. He won second, $3,000 and 4 months of mentorship with a retired tech executive named Howard Briggs. He sat in his car afterward and did not cry, because he had decided a long time ago that he would save that for when he was done. Howard Briggs was 64, white, retired from a company that had been acquired by Google in 2009, and initially skeptical of Marcos in ways he was too polite to express directly but not skilled enough to hide. This is not a criticism of Howard. Howard was a decent man who had spent his career in a world with a specific shape, and Marcos didn't fit that shape, and it took Howard a few weeks to stop looking for the ways the shape needed adjusting and start looking at what was actually in front of him. What was actually in front of him was extraordinary. The technical architecture of Red Common, Howard told him at their 3rd meeting, was more sophisticated than applications he had seen come through seed rounds with million-dollar valuations. The market research was meticulous. The problem was real and documentable, and vast. Marcos had data on 47 million households in the United States that lacked reliable broadband access. "How did you learn to do this?" Howard asked. "Books," Marcos said. "Computers, time." Howard hired his own son, who was a developer, to review the code. His son came back and said it was good. Not perfect. There were architectural choices Howard's son would have made differently, but good, functional, built by someone who understood what the code was supposed to do. Howard called a friend. His friend called someone. That someone's name was Anita Velez. She was a general partner at a small venture fund in San Francisco that focused specifically on underrepresented founders and solutions for underserved communities. She had deployed $40 million over 7 years and had an eye for things that other people missed. She requested a meeting. Marcos bought a new shirt. He took the BART to San Francisco again, and this time he was not carrying his 30-page document in a manila folder. He was carrying a laptop with a polished prototype and a 12-slide pitch deck that Sophia Park had helped him design over 6 grueling weeks. He had rehearsed it 200 times. He was not exaggerating. Anita Velez was 47 direct, and had the specific quality of someone who has heard 10,000 pitches and developed a finely tuned sense for authenticity. She shook Marcos's hand and said, "Tell me what you built." He told her. She asked questions, he answered them. She asked harder questions. He answered those too, and when he didn't know the answer twice, specifically he said, "I don't know, here's how I would find out." She wrote something down when he said that. The meeting was supposed to be 30 minutes. It ran 90. At the end, Anita leaned back in her chair and looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't read. "I need to ask you something directly," she said. "Your immigration status, where does that stand?" "My attorney expects a decision in the next 60 to 90 days, he said. "And if the decision is negative?" He held her gaze. "It won't be." She almost smiled. "That's not an answer." "I know," he said, "but it's what I have." She made an offer 3 weeks later. A seed investment of $400,000 in exchange for 12% equity in Red Kamun LLC, the company he had incorporated with Daniel's help 6 months earlier. The valuation she was giving him implied that she believed the thing he had built from nothing, in a supply closet, on borrowed computers at 2 a.m, was worth more than $3 million. He called Daniel from the parking lot. "It's happening," was all he said. Daniel on the other end was quiet for a moment. Then, "You need to come sign some things." "I know," Marcos said. "Give me a minute." He sat in the parking lot for 4 minutes and let himself feel the full weight of what had happened. Not the victory, not yet, the distance traveled. The distance from the truck that smelled like axle grease, from the fold-out couch, from the cracked molar and the cracked phone screen, from the empty office at 2 a.m. where a man who no one saw had typed *print, hello, and the computer had said it back. Hello. Then he started the car. His immigration status was resolved 2 months later. Daniel called him on a Thursday morning while Marcos was sleeping after his shift. He almost didn't answer. He saw Daniel's name and answered. "It went through," Daniel said. Marcos sat up. "You have work authorization," Daniel said. "Marcos, are you hearing me?" He was hearing him. He was also not quite able to respond, because something was happening in his chest that was not a medical event but felt like one, a compression, a release, something loosening that had been tight for so long he had forgotten it was there. "I'm hearing you," he said. He called his mother after. She answered on the second ring, the way she always did, because she kept her phone closed on Sundays and apparently now on Thursdays too. He told her not everything, not the investments and the equity and the valuation, because those numbers would mean nothing and everything to her in ways he wasn't ready to navigate. He told her simply, "I built something, Mama, something real," and they said yes. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, in Spanish, "Your father always said you were the one who noticed things." He had not known his father said that. He asked her to say it again. She did. The 18 months after the seed round were not easy. Nothing about building a company is easy, regardless of how much money you have or how smart you are or how righteous your mission. Marcos hired 3 engineers, 2 of them from the community workspace in East San Jose, one of them, a recent Berkeley grad who had turned down 2 larger offers because she believed in the problem Red Kamun was solving. He moved out of Adriana's apartment and into a 1-bedroom in a quieter part of the neighborhood, and he felt guilty about that for longer than he expected, until Adriana told him to stop it and hugged him in the kitchen one morning and said, "You made room for us when we needed it. Now go make room for yourself." He kept his night shift job for 4 more months after the funding came through. This was partly financial caution. He had employees to pay and didn't want to draw a salary from the business until revenue was coming in, and partly something harder to name, a reluctance to leave. Not the job itself, but the building, the long nights, the particular quality of silence in those hallways after midnight. On his last night at Hellion Technologies, he cleaned every floor the way he always had, with the same thoroughness, the same care. He cleaned the library on the 2nd floor. He put his hand on the spine of Python Crash Course 2nd edition and stood there for a moment. He thought about leaving a note. He decided against it. Whoever came in the morning wouldn't understand, and the note wasn't for them anyway. He left the building at 5 a.m. and stood on the sidewalk in the early morning fog and looked up at the glass and steel of it, the lights still on in the server room, the building breathing the way buildings do, quietly, constantly, without acknowledgement. "Thank you," he said, to no one in particular, to the building, to the computers, to the empty hallways that had been his classroom. Then he walked to the bus stop for the last time. Red Common launched publicly 22 months after Anita Velez's investment. It launched in San Jose first, because Marcos knew this city, its specific architecture of need, and within 90 days it had been adopted by 42 apartment buildings, covering 11,000 residents. The connectivity improvement in those buildings was measurable and documented. Average download speeds during peak hours increased by 61%. The number of students in those buildings completing online homework assignments on time increased by 38%. Sophia, his niece, the dinosaur enthusiast, was one of them. A journalist from a technology publication wrote a profile. It was a short piece, 500 words, focused on the technical innovation. Marcos gave the interview in his new office, a small room in East San Jose that he had painted himself, with a window that looked out on a parking lot, and answered every question honestly, including the questions about where he'd come from and how he'd learned and what the nights had been like. The piece ran on a Thursday. By Monday, he had received 400 emails. Not all of them were from investors, though many were. Many were from people who had lived inside the problem he'd solved. Parents who recognized their children in his description of Sophia and her homework. People who had grown up in buildings where the internet dropped after 7 p.m. like clockwork. People for whom connectivity was not an abstraction or a luxury, but a daily negotiation with the world's resources, and who those resources were considered to belong to. He read every email. He answered as many as he could. The acquisition offer came in the second year after launch. A larger company, a telecom infrastructure firm based in Atlanta, approached through an intermediary. They had been watching Red Commun's growth metrics for 8 months. They wanted the technology, the team, and the client base. They made an offer. The offer was $12 million. Marcos sat with it for 2 weeks. He talked to Anita, who told him it was a good offer and his decision. He talked to Sophia Park, who walked him through every clause of the term sheet. He talked to Daniel, who said nothing about business but asked how he was feeling. "I don't know," Marcos said honestly. "Is it enough?" "Enough for what?" Daniel asked. He thought about it. "Enough to keep building." Daniel said, "That's the right question." He negotiated. He came back to the table with 3 conditions. That Red Commun's community pricing structure, the subsidized rates for low-income housing, was written into the acquisition agreement as a protected term, not a guideline. That the San Jose team would stay together and based in San Jose for a minimum of 3 years. And that 5% of the acquisition proceeds would go directly to a foundation he wanted to establish for undocumented entrepreneurs. The Atlanta firm agreed to the first 2 conditions outright. They pushed back on the third. He held the line. They agreed. The final number after negotiation was $12.4 million. He signed the papers on a Friday afternoon in a downtown San Jose conference room with Daniel on one side and Sophia Park on the other, and Anita Velez on the phone from San Francisco. When it was done, Sophia shook his hand and Daniel bear hugged him, and Anita said through the phone, "I knew," which was not entirely true but was the right thing to say. He called his mother that night. He told her the full number this time, all of it, the 12 million. He heard her sharp intake of breath and then a long silence. "Marcos," she said. "Yes." "Your father would not have words." "I know," he said, "neither do I." But that wasn't quite true. He had found something, over 5 years of building Red Common in the margins of his impossible life, that felt like the opposite of speechlessness. He had found that he had a language, not just Python, not just English, but something more fundamental. The language of a person who looks at a problem and says, "I can build something that fixes this." The language of a person who decides, in a supply closet at 2 a.m, that the distance between where he is and where he wants to be is not a wall but a road. A long road, a hard road, one that asked for years of quiet, unglamorous, unwitnessed work, one that asked him to give things up: sleep, comfort, the easy mercy of lowered expectations, one that asked him, most of all, to believe in what he was doing in the enormous stretches of time when no one else could see it. But a road. There is a community center in East San Jose now. It has a computer lab with 32 workstations, open to the public until midnight every day. On the wall near the entrance there is a small framed photograph, a man in a gray janitor's uniform, pushing a cart down a hallway, taken from behind, his face not visible. Below it, a single line. He built what he needed from what he had. Marcos chose the photo himself. People ask him sometimes why he didn't choose something more triumphant, a photo from the signing, from the launch, from any of the moments that looked like winning. He always answers the same way. Because the hallway is where it happened, he says. Not the conference room, not the deal, the hallway, 2 a.m, alone, that's where I became who I am. He still takes the bus sometimes, not because he has to, because on the bus at 6 a.m, the city is alive in a particular way, the people who work the hours that others sleep, the people pushing carts and wearing uniforms and carrying backpacks with lunch inside, the people whose faces the world has learned to look past, the way the world looks past anything it considers part of the furniture. He sees them. He has always seen them. Because he was one of them. And he still is, in every way that matters, in the part of him that was forged in the early morning hours of an empty building, with a borrowed computer, and a notebook, and a question that refused to stay quiet. What if I built something? What if? The lesson is not that every janitor is a secret genius. The lesson is not that hard work always wins, or that America rewards the deserving, or that one man's story can be every man's story. The lesson is simpler and harder than all of that. The lesson is this: the world will give you a very clear picture of what it thinks you are worth. It will hand you a uniform and a cart and a badge with small letters. It will design its hallways so that you move through them without disturbing the people inside. It will build its systems with doors that don't open for you, and then it will tell you, kindly or unkindly, that this is simply how things are. And you have a choice. You can accept the picture, or you can stay late after everyone goes home, and open a book and begin. Not because success is guaranteed, it isn't, not because the road is short, it won't be, but because the alternative, the life lived entirely inside the limits that others have drawn for you, is its own kind of loss, a quiet one, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind you only feel fully when it's very late and very silent and you're alone with the person you might have been. Marcos Reyes refused that loss. He stayed late. He opened the book. And in the glow of a borrowed computer, in the silence of a building that did not know he was there, he typed his first word into the darkness.